The dust hadn't even settled. It hung in the night air like a thick, choking fog of pulverized limestone and shattered pride. Red and blue emergency lights sliced through the gray haze, illuminating the panicked faces of men who had just realized that physics doesn't care about their profit margins. I stepped out of the state vehicle, my boots hitting the dirt. My cousin's fast-track tunnel had just collapsed, and he was somewhere under 1,000 tons of fractured rock. I could taste the silica in the air the moment the heavy doors of the SUV clicked open. It coated my teeth and settled in the back of my throat, a gritty, metallic reminder of what happens when you don't respect the mountain. The Appalachian Ridge Extension project was supposed to be the crown jewel of apex engineering. Now, it was a mass grave waiting to happen. Sirens wailed in a dissonant chorus, bouncing off the sheer rock faces of the valley. Floodlights had been hastily erected, casting long, frantic shadows across the staging area. The mouth of the tunnel, or what used to be the mouth, was completely choked with jagged slate, twisted rebar, and the shattered remnants of what looked like a secondary support strut. It hadn't just caved. It had suffered a catastrophic lateral structural failure. The Earth had simply decided to take back the space we had hollowed out. Director Boyd from State Emergency Management was waiting for me at the perimeter line. A hard-nosed man in his late 50s, with eyes like flint and a jawline set in permanent frustration. He didn't waste time with pleasantries or handshakes. "Snyder," he barked over the deafening roar of a portable diesel generator. "You made good time." "Traffic gets out of the way when you have state troopers leading the escort, Director," I replied, my voice steady despite the adrenaline humming in my veins. I looked past him to the collapse. The structural shearing was obvious even from 100 yards away. The rock face above the portal was heavily fissured. "Give me the tactical." "Seismic sensors tripped at 2140 hours, Boyd said, pulling a ruggedized tablet from his vest. "Complete roof collapse in Sector 4, roughly 2 miles deep. We've got 40 men on the surface who made it out the trailing crew. But the inner crew—" Boyd paused, his expression tightening. "We've got 5 trapped in the deep cut, including the project manager, your cousin, Wagner." Owen. Of course he was down there. He always liked to be on site for the photo ops when a major excavation milestone was hit, pretending he knew the dirt as well as the men who dug it. He loved wearing the pristine white hard hat for the cameras. "Is there an air pocket?" I asked, pulling my own scuffed yellow hard hat from my duffel bag. "We think so. Ground-penetrating radar shows a cavity near the boring machine, but the overburden is massively unstable. The corporate suits have been running around like headless chickens for the last 2 hours. They tried to send a recovery team in with heavy loaders, nearly got them killed in a secondary rockfall. That's when I pulled their authority, invoked the emergency statutes, and called you." Boyd handed me a sealed blue folder. It was a state emergency mandate. It effectively dissolved Apex Engineering's jurisdiction over the site and placed complete, unquestionable operational control in my hands as the lead rescue director. We walked toward the main command tent, a large canvas structure flapping violently in the wind. Outside it, pacing nervously in their soot-stained Italian suits, were the board members of Apex, the very men who, 6 months ago, had told me my methods were antiquated and my timelines uncompetitive. When they saw me approaching with Boyd, the pacing stopped. The lead director, a finance guy named Holloway, stepped forward. His face was pale, his eyes wide and streaked with sweat. "John," Holloway stammered, his gaze darting between me and the state officials flanking us. "Thank God you're here. We need your help. The rescue crews are refusing our orders. Owen is down there, John. You have to tell them to dig. We're losing time." I looked at Holloway. I didn't feel anger or vindication or even the bitter satisfaction I thought I might feel if this day ever came. I just felt the cold hard weight of the mathematics. 1,000 tons of rock, 48 hours of breathable air, 5 lives. "I'm not here to help you, Holloway," I said quietly, my voice carrying over the din of the site with chilling clarity. I held up the blue folder. "As of 3 minutes ago, the state of New York has assumed control of this disaster site. You no longer have a say in what happens here. If any of you interfere with my crew, step past the barricades, or issue a single directive, Director Boyd will have you arrested and jailed for obstructing a state emergency operation." Holloway opened his mouth, then closed it. The reality of his absolute powerlessness settled over him like the dust coating his shoulders. I didn't wait for a response. I turned my back on the board and walked into the command tent. It was time to go to work. 6 months earlier, the air in the Apex boardroom had been sterile, climate-controlled and smelling faintly of expensive leather and stale espresso. It was a world entirely insulated from the grit, sweat, and lethal danger of a tunnel phase, which is exactly why the men sitting around the mahogany table made such terrible decisions about it. I stood at the head of the room, laser pointer in hand, finishing my presentation for the director of excavation role. I was 54 years old, with 30 years of dirt under my fingernails and a track record of 0 structural fatalities. I knew the Appalachian Ridge project inside and out. I knew the geological surveys, the deep fault lines, and the unpredictable, treacherous shale deposits waiting beneath the surface. To summarize, I said, projecting my voice to command the quiet room, the geological makeup of Sector 4 is highly fractured. We are dealing with Class 4 sedimentary rock. It is unforgiving and prone to sudden load shifts. My engineering plan mandates an 18-month timeline. We will use comprehensive redundant steel shoring every 10 feet. We do not advance the boring machine until the roof is secured with heavy I-beams. It's slow, it's expensive, but it guarantees structural integrity and, more importantly, the safety of our crews. I clicked to the final slide, a detailed CAD rendering of the reinforced tunnel, overlaid with stress heat maps. I saw Holloway shift uncomfortably in his seat. The other board members checked their phones or their watches. They didn't care about rock classifications or load paths. They cared about quarterly margins and shareholder dividends. That was when Owen Wagner stood up. Owen was in his early 30s, my cousin on my mother's side, possessing a degree in business management with a minor in engineering. He had never swung a pickaxe, never operated a drill, and never felt a tunnel roof groan under millions of pounds of sheer pressure. But he wore a tailored suit perfectly, had a devastating smile, and knew exactly how to speak the language of corporate greed. "John, your thoroughness is, as always, highly commendable," Owen said, his voice slick with practice charm. He walked to the front of the room, gently pushing past me to plug his own drive into the projector. "But in today's market, an 18-month delay is a death sentence for our stock price. We need to be aggressive. We need to value engineer this project to meet the modern demands of our investors." A new slide appeared on the screen. It was a stripped-down, dangerously bare version of my schematics. "I've spent the last 3 weeks reviewing the data with a fresh perspective," Owen continued, pacing confidently. "By utilizing advanced rock bolting techniques and a high-tensile shotcrete layer, we can bypass the heavy steel shoring in Sector 4 entirely. The rock is self-supporting enough if we move fast and lock it in. We can cut the timeline down to 9 months and save the company $12 million in raw materials alone." The change in the room's atmosphere was instantaneous. Holloway leaned forward, his eyes suddenly bright with dollar signs. $12 million? And a completion bonus from the state if we finish under a year, Owen added, smiling warmly at Holloway. "Which, under my leadership, we will." I stared at the screen, my blood running cold. I recognized what he was proposing. It wasn't innovation. It was a lethal gamble. "Owen," I said, keeping my voice dangerously low, "you cannot rock bolt fractured shale in a high-stress geological zone. The pressure gradient will tear those bolts out of the ceiling like toothpicks. The rock isn't self-supporting. It's resting on a dormant slip fault. If you pull the primary steel supports, the load path will shift and the roof will inevitably cave." Owen offered me a patronizing smile, the kind you give a child who doesn't understand adult matters. "John, I know you're old school, but materials science has advanced. The computer models hold up." "Computer models don't bleed when a ceiling drops," I fired back, stepping toward him. I turned to face the board directly. "Listen to me very carefully. I know this mountain. If you approve his timeline, you are building a tomb. You will kill people to save $12 million. Holloway held up a hand, his face stern. "Let's keep the emotion out of this, John. We're looking at hard data. Owen's proposal brings us in under budget and well ahead of schedule. Your proposal bankrupts the project's profit margin before we even break ground. My proposal ensures the men coming to work go home to their families," I stated, planting both hands flat on the mahogany table, forcing Holloway to meet my eyes. "I will not put my signature on a suicide mission." Holloway's gaze hardened, devoid of empathy. "Then perhaps you aren't the right fit for the director position, John. We need forward thinkers, not roadblocks." They voted right then and there. It was unanimous. Owen was named director of excavation. They congratulated him, shook his hand, and immediately began discussing the new executive bonus structure. I didn't say another word. I packed up my blueprints, walked out of the boardroom, and submitted my resignation to HR an hour later. I knew with mathematical certainty that this day was coming. I just didn't know exactly when the mountain would collect its debt. The command tent smelled heavily of ozone, diesel exhaust, and stale coffee. Screens lined the far wall, displaying live feeds from the seismic sensors, ground-penetrating radar arrays, and thermal imaging cameras. It was a high-tech nerve center built to manage a disaster that never should have happened in the first place. I dropped my heavy canvas bag onto the central planning table and unrolled a massive sheet of topographical maps, weighing the corners down with spare radio batteries. "Talk to me, Luke," I said, not looking up as my eyes traced the contour lines of the mountain. Luke, my old foreman, stepped up to the table. He was 58, built like a fire hydrant, and possessed a profound vocal distrust for anyone who wore a tie to a job site. He was the best tunnel man I had ever known, and the only reason I hadn't lost my mind when I worked at Apex. When I left, Luke had stayed, bound by a union pension he couldn't afford to walk away from. We hadn't spoken in 6 months, but the moment I walked into the tent, it was as if no time had passed at all. "It's a complete mess, John," Luke growled, his voice thick with gravel and exhaustion. He traced a thick, calloused finger over the map, stopping at a red X deep inside the schematic. Sector 4 went down hard. About 300 feet of tunnel ceiling completely pancaked. We estimate the cave-in trapped Wagner and 4 engineers near the TPM, the tunnel boring machine. "Air supply?" I asked, examining the cross-section of the collapse zone. "The TBM has a reinforced cabin and emergency oxygen scrubbers," Luke explained. "If they realized what was happening and made it inside the machine before the ceiling dropped, they've got 48 hours of breathable air. Maybe a little more if they stay perfectly calm and don't exert themselves." "It's Owen," I said flatly, pulling a mechanical pencil from my pocket. "He's not staying calm." Before Luke could reply, the heavy canvas flap of the tent whipped open. Holloway barged in, followed by 2 other board members. The state troopers outside had tried to stop them, but Holloway had pushed past in a blind panic. "Snyder, we need an update immediately," Holloway demanded, his voice shrill, a stark contrast to his boardroom bravado. "Our PR team is getting killed by the press. When are you sending the heavy machinery in to dig them out?" "We have 4 heavy excavators sitting idle on the perimeter." I slowly looked up from the map. The sheer, terrifying ignorance of the question was staggering. "If you put a heavy tread excavator on that unstable scree slope, the vibration will trigger a secondary collapse," I explained, my voice devoid of any emotion or inflection. "The shock waves will travel through the fractured rock, crush the remaining air pocket, and turn 5 men into paste. It's basic physics." "Then what the hell are you doing?" Holloway yelled, his face flushing dark red. "You're just standing here looking at paper." "That's our director of excavation down there." "That's your own flesh and blood, for God's sake." I felt Luke tense beside me, his fists clenching so hard his knuckles turned white. I stood up to my full height, walked slowly around the planning table, and closed the distance between me and Holloway until I was inches from his face. Up close, the panic in his eyes was vivid and desperate. He wasn't mourning my cousin, he was mourning his stock options and dreading the impending manslaughter charges. "Let me explain exactly how this works, Holloway," I said, my voice dropping to a quiet, lethal whisper. "You are currently standing in a restricted state zone. You are breathing air that belongs to my rescue operation. Your director of excavation is buried under 1,000 tons of rock because you chose a $12 million saving over my safety protocols. So no, I am not sending in excavators to appease your PR team." I turned to the 2 state troopers standing by the tent entrance. "Officers," I said, "remove these men from the command perimeter. If they cross the line again, detain them in the back of a squad car." Holloway sputtered, stepping back. "You can't do this. I am the chairman of Apex, and I am the law on this mountain." I cut him off, my voice cracking like a whip. "Get them out." The troopers didn't hesitate. They gripped Holloway and the board members by their expensive lapels and physically hauled them out of the tent, tossing them back into the dust. The canvas flap fell shut, instantly muting their protests. The command tent was quiet again, save for the hum of the computer servers and the distant, eerie shifting of the mountain. I walked back to the table and picked up my pencil. "All right, Luke, no heavy machinery. We're going to have to micro-drill a pilot hole for acoustic comms, then plan a structural breach from the lateral ventilation shaft." "The lateral shaft is highly unstable, John," Luke warned, leaning over the map. "It's resting on the same fault." "I know," I said, marking a trajectory through the rock. "Let's do the math." The transition period was supposed to take 2 weeks. I made it 4 days. Packing up an office you've occupied for a decade is a quiet, methodical process. I was pulling down framed core samples and rolling up my original geological surveys when Luke walked in. His face was the color of old brick, and he was carrying a roll of freshly printed schematics. He slammed them down on my desk, scattering a box of paper clips. "Have you seen what that kid is doing?" Luke demanded, his voice thick with disbelief. I stopped packing and looked at the blueprints. They bore Owen's digital signature, approved just that morning. It was the implementation phase of the pitch he had made to the board. Seeing it on paper, translated into actual construction orders, made my stomach turn. Owen hadn't just reduced the heavy steel shoring, he had completely eliminated it in the transition zones. He was relying entirely on a lattice of 6-foot rock bolts and a thin, pressurized spray of concrete to hold back millions of tons of prehistoric shale. It was an engineering strategy suitable for solid granite, not the fractured, temperamental rock of the Appalachian Ridge. "He's increasing the daily advance rate of the boring machine by 40%, Luke said, jabbing a finger at the excavation schedule. "He's skipping the stabilization delays. He told the shift bosses that the concrete cures fast enough to take the load." "It won't," I said, tracing the projected stress lines with my pen. "The concrete is just a band-aid. Without the steel I-beams transferring the weight down to the floor, the kinetic energy of the mountain has nowhere to go. It will seek the path of least resistance." The door to my office opened, and Owen walked in. He was wearing a brand-new, spotless safety vest over a crisp button-down shirt. He looked like a man playing dress-up in a hardware store. "John, Luke," Owen said, flashing that polished, easy smile. "I heard you reviewing the new specs. I know it's a paradigm shift, but the models are solid. We're going to set a regional record for advancement speed." Luke crossed his arms, glaring at him. "You're going to set a record for structural anomalies, Wagner. The rock in Sector 4 is crumbling. You can't just bolt it and pray." Owen's smile tightened, his eyes darting to me, expecting me to manage my foreman. "Luke, I appreciate your on-the-ground perspective, but we are running a modern operation now. The board has approved the value engineering protocols. We have a schedule to keep." "Value engineering," I repeated, the words tasting like ash in my mouth. I rolled up the blueprints and handed them back to Luke. I picked up my cardboard box. "There is no value in ignoring physics, Owen. The mountain doesn't care about your quarterly targets, and it certainly doesn't care about your bonus." "John, don't be bitter," Owen sighed, adopting a tone of wounded patience. "I wanted to keep you on as an advisor. We're family, but you have to adapt." "I am adapting," I said, walking past him toward the door. "I'm leaving before I have to pull you out of the rubble. Mark my words, Owen. The rock will shift, and when it does, your bolts will snap like dry twigs." I didn't wait for his response. I walked out of the trailer, got into my truck, and drove away from Apex Engineering. I didn't look back in the rearview mirror. Present day. T-minus 36 hours. The whine of the diamond-tipped micro-drill was a high dentistral screech that vibrated directly into the jawbone. We were situated in the lateral ventilation shaft, a secondary access tunnel that ran parallel to the main cut. The air was thick with rock dust and the smell of hot hydraulic fluid. "Depth is 290 feet, the drill operator called out, his eyes glued to the telemetry monitor. "Torque is dropping. Resistance is fading. We're through. We have a breach into the cavity." "Cut the engine," I ordered. The deafening whine spooled down into silence, leaving only the sound of heavy breathing and the distant, unsettling groans of the shifting mountain above us. "Feed the acoustic line," I told Luke. Luke meticulously guided the thin, fiber-optic communication wire down the pilot hole. It was tipped with a highly sensitive microphone and a small speaker. We watched the depth gauge on the monitor tick down. 250, 250, 290. "Contact," Luke whispered. He plugged the surface end of the wire into a ruggedized, military-grade transceiver box. He flipped the power switch and turned up the gain. At first, there was only the hiss of static, followed by the sound of dripping water. Then a ragged hitching sound. Someone was weeping. I picked up the heavy plastic microphone. I didn't press the transmit button immediately. I took a slow, measured breath, locking away every ounce of history, every Thanksgiving dinner, every arrogant smirk Owen had ever given me. I became exactly what the situation required, a machine designed to solve a fatal equation. I pressed the button. "This is Lead Rescue Director John Snyder. Do you copy?" The weeping stopped instantly. A clatter of movement echoed over the speaker, followed by a frantic, breathless voice. "John? John, is that you?" "Oh God, John, thank God." It was Owen. His voice was pitched an octave higher than normal, completely stripped of its corporate polish. He sounded like a terrified child. "Confirm your status, Owen," I said, my voice perfectly level. "Are you inside the TBM cabin?" "Yes." Yes, I'm in the cabin. It's completely dark, John. The power was severed. The roof just came down. It sounded like a bomb. It sounded like a bomb. It's so cold. Who's with you? I asked. Just me. Owen sobbed, his panic accelerating. The others, the engineers, they were on the scaffolding when the first strut failed. I ran for the cabin. I don't know where they are, John. You have to get me out of here. The walls are groaning. I think it's going to collapse again. I looked at Luke. Luke closed his eyes and slowly shook his head. If the engineers were on the scaffolding when the roof pancaked, there was zero probability of survival. Owen was the only one left. Listen to me carefully, Owen, I said, my tone remaining entirely clinical. You are trapped beneath 300 feet of unstable shale. The atmospheric scrubbers in the TBM cabin will give you approximately 36 more hours of breathable air. If you hyperventilate, you will consume that air in 20. You need to control your breathing. 36 hours, Owen screamed over the static. You have excavators. I saw them on the manifest. Dig me out. I'm your family, John. You can't just leave me in the dark. Heavy machinery will trigger a secondary collapse that will crush the TBM cabin, I stated, staring blankly at the metal casing of the transceiver. We are engineering a manual breach through the lateral shaft. We will reach you, but it will take time. Your only job right now is to sit down, stay quiet, and breathe slowly. Do you understand? John, please, Owen begged, his voice breaking into a pathetic whine. I'm sorry, okay? I'm sorry about the promotion. I'm sorry about the board. Just please get me out. I don't want to die down here. He was looking for absolution. He wanted the comfort of family, a promise that everything would be forgiven and fine. I had neither to give him. Apologies do not alter geological reality, Owen, I replied coldly. Conserve your oxygen. We will check in every hour. I released the transmit button, cutting off his frantic pleading. The silence in the ventilation shaft returned, heavy and absolute. Luke looked at me, a mixture of grim respect and sorrow in his tired eyes. Ice water in your veins, John. Math, Luke, I said, turning back to the schematics. Just math, present day, T-minus 24 hours. The mountain was fighting back. We were 90 feet into the lateral breach, tunneling sideways by hand through the dense rock to reach the air bucket. The rescue crew was working in rotating 15-minute shifts, using pneumatic chisels and hydraulic splitters to break the rock away quietly. I was at the face of the breach, examining the rock wall with a high-powered halogen flashlight, when the floor beneath my boots vibrated. A deep, resonant crack echoed through the shaft, like a cannon firing underwater. Dust rained down from the ceiling. The rescue crew froze, their eyes darting upward in the dim light. Hold the line, I barked, keeping my voice steady to prevent a panic. I aimed the beam of my flashlight at the ceiling of the lateral shaft. A massive, jagged fissure had just opened directly above us, spiderwebbing across the rock face. A slab of limestone roughly the size of a city bus was shifting. If it dropped, it would sever our access tunnel, crush the rescue crew, and seal Owen's fate permanently. My radio crackled. It was Director Boyd on the surface. Snyder, seismic sensors are spiking in your sector. We're reading a massive load shift. Do you need to evacuate the shaft? If we evacuated, we would lose 6 hours resetting the operation. Owen didn't have 6 hours to spare. Negative, Director, I replied, clipping the radio back to my vest. We have a localized structural anomaly. We are going to secure it. I turned to Luke. We need temporary shoring right now. Bring up the hydraulic struts and the heavy timber. Within 2 minutes, the crew was muscling heavy steel hydraulic jacks and thick wooden beams to the front of the tunnel. The fissure above us groaned again, widening by a fraction of an inch. A small cascade of pebbles bounced off my hard hat. John, Owen's voice suddenly crackled over the acoustic transceiver unit strapped to my chest. He was monitoring our radio frequency from the TBM cabin. John, I heard the crack. What's happening? Are you guys leaving? Don't leave me. Keep the channel clear, Owen, I said sharply. I didn't have the bandwidth to manage his emotional breakdown. I stepped directly beneath the fractured slab, aiming my light to find the apex of the stress point. Luke, set the first jack here. We need to transfer the load back into the solid wall. It's dropping, John, Owen wailed over the radio. The roof in here is bowing. I can hear the metal of the cabin buckling. You have to hurry. Shut up, Owen, I snapped, my eyes fixed on the geometry of the ceiling. Luke, pup it up. Slow and steady. Luke engaged the hydraulic jack. The heavy steel piston rose, pressing the thick timber beam against the sagging ceiling. The metal of the jack shrieked as it took on the immense weight of the mountain. Creak. groan. "It's not enough," I said, watching a new fracture line shoot across the rock. The load path was asymmetric. The rock wanted to slide, not just drop. "We need a diagonal brace to pin it against the sidewall. Give me a 60-degree angle on the second jack." "John, I can't breathe." Owen was hyperventilating over the comms, the sound wet and frantic. "The air is getting thin." "Please." "The air is fine, you're panicking," I said over my shoulder, grabbing a heavy timber beam myself to help Luke position it. "Lock it in, Luke. Pump it." The second jack engaged, driving the diagonal brace into the corner of the slab. The entire tunnel echoed with a terrifying grinding noise as the stone resisted the steel. For 5 agonizing seconds, the mountain weighed its options, deciding whether to crush us or yield. Then the groaning stopped. The fissure held. The hydraulic jacks locked into place. Taking the load, I let out a slow breath, wiping a thick mixture of sweat and rock dust from my eyes. "Load path secured," I transmitted to Boyd on the surface. "We are resuming the breach." "God, John," Owen sobbed over the comms, his voice small and pathetic. "I thought you were dead." I thought I was dead. I stared at the heavy steel struts holding the ceiling up, the exact same kind of struts Owen had deemed too expensive to use in his tunnel. "We're still here, Owen," I said, my voice echoing off the cold stone walls. "We're doing the job you didn't. Present day, T-18 hours." With the ceiling stabilized, the rescue crew resumed the slow, agonizing process of chipping away at the final 20 feet of rock separating us from the TBM cabin. The air in the lateral shaft was sweltering, thick with the smell of hydraulic fluid and exhausted men. I was at the makeshift staging table set up slightly behind the workface, poring over the digitized schematics of Sector 4 on a ruggedized tablet. I needed to know exactly where we were going to break through the cabin wall so we didn't accidentally sever the TBM's internal oxygen lines. Luke walked over, wiping grease from his hands with a dirty rag. He looked over my shoulder at the tablet. "Something's been bothering me, John," Luke said, his voice a low rumble over the noise of the pneumatic chisels. "When the roof came down, it sheared completely. It didn't buckle, it just dropped." "Total structural failure," I agreed, expanding the blueprint on the screen. "The rock bolts pulled straight out." "Yeah, but look at the specs for the transition zone." Luke pointed a blunt finger at a section of the digital map just before the collapse point. "Even under Owing's value engineering plan, there were supposed to be secondary steel ribs installed every 30 feet to bridge the fault line. It's listed right here on the approved schematic." I stared at the screen. Luke was right. The blueprints clearly indicated secondary steel I-beams in the transition zone leading up to Sector 4. They were inadequate for the geology, but they were supposed to be there. "I was the first one into the portal after the dust settled," Luke continued, his brow furrowed in grim confusion. "I didn't see any steel ribs in the rubble, John. Just rock and rebar. If those ribs had been installed, they would be twisted and mangled, but they'd be there." A cold, sharp realization began to crystallize in my mind. I quickly navigated away from the blueprints and accessed the state's emergency server, pulling up Apex Engineering's digital manifest and purchase orders for the last 3 months. I had full administrative access under the emergency mandate. I cross-referenced the purchase orders for heavy steel with the delivery logs for the site. "Look at this," I said, my voice dropping to a harsh whisper. Luke leaned in. The order for the secondary steel ribs was placed, but it was canceled. 3 days before the collapse. Canceled by Owen Wagner. I read the digital authorization code out loud. I felt a cold fury building in my chest, replacing the clinical detachment I had maintained so carefully. I checked the project ledger. He canceled the order and reallocated the funds into the project's operational surplus account. "Why the hell would he do that?" Luke asked, though the disgust on his face told me he already knew the answer. "Because Apex executive bonuses are tied directly to the operational surplus at the end of the quarter," I said, the math clicking into place with sickening clarity. "He didn't just value engineer the project to save time, Luke. He flat out embezzled the safety budget. He canceled the steel, hid the change from the board, and pocketed the difference to trigger a massive payout." Luke stared at the tablet, his jaw clenching. 5 men were dead, and a massive infrastructure project was ruined. So a 30-something corporate climber could buy a bigger boat. I looked up from the tablet, staring down the dark tunnel toward the rock face where the crew was working. Behind that wall of stone was a man who had traded the lives of his crew for a bonus check. "Keep digging," I told Luke, my voice devoid of any warmth. "We're going to get him out. And then I'm going to destroy him." Present day, T-12 hours. The acoustic comms unit crackled to life. It was 3 a.m. on the surface, but time had lost all meaning underground. We were less than 10 feet away from the TBM cabin. The air was getting dangerously thin. The crew was taking longer breaks, breathing hard in the oppressive heat. "John," Owen's voice hissed over the speaker. It was a hollow, wretched sound. He wasn't crying anymore. He sounded broken, hollowed out by the suffocating darkness and the creeping reality of his situation. "Are you still there?" I stepped away from the workface and picked up the microphone. "I'm here, Owen. We are 10 feet out. The breach is proceeding on schedule." "I can't see anything, John. Emergency lights died hours ago. It's just black. It's so quiet. I keep thinking I hear them." "Hear who?" "The engineers," Owen whispered, a tremor returning to his voice. "Miller, Davies, the others. I keep thinking I hear them knocking on the outside of the hull. But I know they're dead, John. I know they didn't make it. The roof came down so fast. I didn't offer comfort. I didn't say it wasn't your fault because it was. I just held the button down and let him speak into the void. I didn't think it would happen," Owen babbled, the isolation stripping away whatever defenses he had left. "The computer models said the rock would hold. They said the shotcrete was enough. I just wanted to show the board that I could do it better, faster." "The models were flawed," I stated coldly. "The geology in Sector 4 is highly fractured shale. It doesn't hold tension." "I know," Owen cried out suddenly, his voice cracking. "I know, okay? I looked at your old surveys. I saw the fault lines. But Holloway was pushing for the bonus. He said if we didn't hit the surplus target, the project would be audited. I couldn't let them audit the books, John." I pressed the transmit button. My eyes locked on the digital readouts of the canceled purchase orders on my tablet. "Why couldn't you let them audit the books, Owen?" I asked quietly. Silence stretched over the line. For a long moment, the only sound was the distant rhythm of the pneumatic chisels. "Because of the steel," Owen finally whispered, his voice saturated with guilt and terror. "I canceled the order for the transition ribs. I diverted the funds. If they audited us, they would see that I didn't install the secondary supports. I thought if we just pushed through the sector quickly, no one would ever know. The concrete would hide it. There it was. A full confession, broadcast over an unencrypted emergency channel, logged and recorded by the state equipment on the surface. He was so desperate for connection, so terrified of dying alone in the dark, that he gave me exactly what I needed. "I'm sorry, John," Owen sobbed. "I'm so sorry. I'll resign. I'll give back the money. Just please, get me out. I don't want to die down here." I felt Luke watching me. He had heard every word over the external speaker. He looked disgusted, angry enough to walk away and let the mountain keep him. I looked at the rock wall separating me from the man who had stolen my job, ruined my reputation, and killed his own crew for a payday. It would be so easy to just stop digging, to say the roof was too unstable, to pack up the gear and walk away. But I am an engineer. I fix what is broken, and I don't leave jobs unfinished. "Conserve your oxygen, Owen," I said, my voice as hard and unyielding as the rock around us. "We are preparing for the final breach, present day. T-2 hours. The digital display on the air quality monitor glowed a harsh red. We were at the final barrier, a 3-foot thick layer of heavily fractured shale resting directly against the steel hull of the TVM cabin. We couldn't use the pneumatic chisels anymore. The vibration would shatter the remaining rock and potentially crush the cabin like a tin can. "We do this by hand," I ordered, picking up a heavy steel pry bar. Slow and precise, we find the fault lines in the rock and we split it. The crew, exhausted and coated in a thick paste of sweat and gray dust, nodded grimly. For the next hour, we worked in agonizing silence, prying chunks of stone away from the wall with agonizing care. Every scrape of metal against rock sounded like an explosion in the confined space. Finally, my pry bar slid into a crack and hit something that didn't sound like stone. It was a dull, metallic thud. "Contact," I said softly. We cleared the remaining rubble away by hand, exposing a small 2-foot section of the TBM steel hull. It was bowed inward under the immense pressure, heavily scratched, but intact. "Get the plasma cutter," Luke ordered one of the crew. "Negative," I stopped him. "The cabin is sealed. If we use a thermal cutter, we'll rapidly deplete the remaining oxygen inside, and the heat could ignite any hydraulic fluid that leaked into the cabin during the collapse. We use the cold saw." Luke nodded, handing me a heavy, battery-powered rotary saw equipped with a diamond carbide blade designed for cutting hardened steel. I stepped up to the exposed hull. I could hear faint, frantic scratching from the other side. Owen knew we were there. Owen. I transmitted over the comms, my voice booming through the small speaker inside the cabin. Move to the back of the cabin. Cover your face. We are breaching the hull. I didn't wait for a reply. I engaged the saw. The blade bit into the steel with a deafening shriek, throwing a shower of bright orange sparks into the dim tunnel. I pressed hard, letting the weight of the tool do the work, ignoring the burning ache in my shoulders. Cut. Pause. Breathe. I worked in a precise rectangle, tracing the outline of an escape hatch. The air in the lateral shaft grew thick with the smell of vaporized metal. Finally, the blade punched through. A hiss of stale, compressed air rushed out from the cabin, smelling strongly of sweat and fear. I finished the final cut, kicked the steel plate inward with my heavy boot, and stepped back. The hole was jagged and small, barely wide enough for a man to squeeze through. For a long moment, there was nothing but darkness inside. Then, a trembling, soot-stained hand reached out through the opening, gripping the jagged edge of the steel. "Help me!" a ragged voice gasped from the dark. Luke and another crew member stepped forward, grabbing the hand and hauling the man out of the hole. Owen collapsed onto the rocky floor of the tunnel. He was unrecognizable. His expensive clothes were shredded and covered in thick, greasy grime. His face was pale beneath a mask of dirt, his eyes wide and bloodshot, darting around the dim tunnel like a trapped animal. He was hyperventilating, weeping openly as he scrambled away from the breach hole. He looked up and saw me standing there, holding the heavy rotary saw, my face illuminated by the harsh glare of the halogen work lights. "John," Owen gasped, reaching out toward me, expecting a hand up, expecting the warm embrace of family, expecting a return to normalcy. "You did it. You saved me." I looked down at him. I didn't offer my hand. I didn't smile. I just stared at the pathetic, broken man on the floor. "Medic," I called out over my shoulder, my voice devoid of any emotion. "Assess him for transport, then get him out of my sight." The ascent to the surface was an agonizingly slow operation. Transporting a broken, hyperventilating man through 300 feet of a hastily shored ventilation shaft requires a brutal, uncompromising level of discipline. It's an environment where a single misplaced boot, a single dropped tool, or a sudden panic attack could cause a secondary shift in the rock wall and kill everyone involved. We strapped Owen into a rigid, bright orange Stokes basket. He didn't fight us. He lacked the energy. He lay there shivering violently, his eyes fixed on the ceiling of the narrow shaft, his hands clutching the canvas straps across his chest, so hard his knuckles bled. I didn't speak to him during the extraction. I guided the front of the basket, while Luke and the rescue crew managed the rear lines, slowly hauling him up the incline. The only sounds in the tunnel were the scraping of the heavy plastic basket against the jagged shale, the harsh, synchronized breathing of the crew, and Owen's quiet, continuous sobbing. When we finally breached the portal and stepped out into the night air, the atmosphere on the surface was electric. The blinding white glare of the emergency floodlights washed over us. The deafening roar of the diesel generators, which we had been isolated from deep inside the mountain, hit us like a physical wall of sound. A cheer went up from the perimeter where the state troopers were holding back the press and the remaining Apex personnel. They saw the orange basket. They saw a survivor. A motion for the paramedics to move in. They rushed forward with trauma bags and oxygen tanks, immediately surrounding the basket and assessing Owen's vitals. Director Boyd stepped out from the command tent, his face impassive, his eyes scanning the scene before locking onto me. He gave a single, curt nod of acknowledgement. Owen weakly pushed an oxygen mask away from his face. He blinked against the harsh lighting, his eyes darting wildly until they found me standing a few feet away, quietly removing my hard hat. "John," Owen croaked, his voice raw. He reached a trembling hand out toward me again. "John, I owe you everything. You saved my life. I'll make it right. I swear to God, I'll make it right with the company." He still thought this was a corporate transaction. He thought the blood on his hands could be washed away with a boardroom apology and a reallocation of funds. He expected the embrace of family, a quiet sweep under the rug, a graceful exit strategy. I walked over to the stretcher. I looked down at him, my expression completely neutral, feeling nothing but a profound, hollow exhaustion. "You don't owe me anything, Owen," I said quietly, ensuring only he and the medics could hear. "And you don't have a company anymore." I looked up and caught the eye of the lead state investigator, a stern-faced woman in a tactical windbreaker who had been waiting patiently near the ambulances. I pointed to the stretcher. "He's stable for transport," I told her. "He is all yours." The investigator stepped forward, flanked by two armed state troopers. "Owen Wagner," she said, her voice cutting through the noise of the site. "You are being detained under suspicion of criminal negligence and corporate fraud. Once you are medically cleared at the hospital, you will be formally charged." Owen's eyes went wide with sheer terror. "What? No! John, tell them! It was an accident. The rock shifted." "John." The paramedics loaded the stretcher into the back of the ambulance. As the heavy doors slammed shut, cutting off his frantic pleading, I turned away. I walked back toward the command tent to begin the debrief. The rescue was over. Now, it was time for the autopsy. 1 week later, the hearing room in the state capitol building in Albany was a stark, jarring contrast to the dirt, diesel, and darkness of the Appalachian Ridge. It was a cavernous room of polished oak, brass fixtures, and sterile fluorescent lighting. It was a room designed for men who wore expensive suits and spoke in carefully rehearsed legal jargon. Holloway and the remaining members of the Apex Engineering Board sat at the respondents' table. They were flanked by a small army of high-priced corporate defense attorneys. Holloway looked pale, but he maintained a veneer of indignance, adjusting his silk tie and whispering furiously to his lead counsel. I sat at the witness table, flanked by Director Boyd and the state's lead prosecutor. The inquiry panel, a row of severe-looking judges and state infrastructure officials, called the room to order. They had spent the first 2 hours of the hearing listening to Apex's lawyers spin a narrative of unforeseeable geological anomalies, acts of God, and acceptable margins of error in modern engineering. They were trying to frame it as a tragic, unavoidable accident. When it was my turn to testify, the room fell dead silent. "Mr. Snyder," the lead commissioner said, adjusting his glasses, "you were the lead rescue director on site. You also previously served as a senior engineer for Apex. Could you please provide your assessment of the structural failure in Sector 4? I leaned forward, pulling the microphone closer. I didn't look at Holloway. I looked directly at the commissioner. "It was not a geological anomaly," I stated, my voice echoing clearly through the large room. "It was a mathematical certainty. The failure was the direct result of gross negligence and deliberate structural sabotage." A murmur rippled through the gallery. Holloway's lawyer shot up. "Objection! The witness is offering speculative conclusions. The witness is the foremost geological authority on that mountain," the commissioner snapped. "Overruled. Continue, Mr. Snyder." I opened the blue folder resting on the table in front of me. 6 months ago, I presented a comprehensive shoring plan to the Apex board, detailing the severe instability of the Class 4's shale in Sector 4. My plan mandated heavy steel I-beam reinforcement. The board rejected this plan in favor of an aggressively value-engineered timeline presented by Owen Wagner, which relied on unproven rock bolting techniques. "A business decision, not a criminal one," Holloway muttered audibly. "However," I continued, raising my voice slightly to talk over him, "upon examining the digital blueprints recovered from the site, even Mr. Wagner's revised plan called for secondary steel ribs in the transition zones to manage the load path." I slid a stack of printed documents across the table to the bailiff, who handed them up to the panel. "Those are the procurement logs," I explained. 3 days before the collapse, Owen Wagner deliberately canceled the purchase order for the secondary steel ribs. He did not install the supports. Furthermore, he manipulated the accounting software to reallocate the $4.2 million saved from that canceled order directly into the project's operational surplus account. Holloway's face drained of all color. His attorneys abruptly stopped writing. "And why would he do that, Mr. Snyder?" the commissioner asked, looking over the documents with a deepening scowl. "Because," I said, finally turning my head to look Holloway dead in the eye, "the executive bonus structure approved by the Apex board, led by Mr. Rawson, Holloway, tied an exorbitant financial payout directly to the size of the operational surplus at the end of the quarter. Owen Wagner removed the only thing keeping the roof from collapsing so that he could trigger a multi-million-dollar bonus for himself and the executives sitting at that table." Pandemonium broke out. Holloway was on his feet, shouting that he had no knowledge of the canceled orders, throwing his own director of excavation under the bus without a second thought. But it didn't matter. The state had the unencrypted audio recordings from the acoustic line. Director Boyd stepped up to the microphone. "Commissioners, the state is submitting into evidence a verified audio recording of Mr. Wagner's confession, captured during the rescue operation. He admits to the embezzlement and admits to concealing the missing steel from the board to protect the bonus payout. The panel didn't need to deliberate long. By the end of the day, Apex Engineering state contracts were permanently revoked. Holloway and the board were hit with a massive civil lawsuit by the state and an immediate federal investigation by OSHA and the SEC. As for Owen, he never even made it to the hearing. He watched it on a television screen from a holding cell at the county jail, awaiting trial for 5 counts of involuntary manslaughter. 6 months later, the first hard frost of November had settled over the valley, turning the mud of the staging area into solid, unyielding iron. My breath plumed in the freezing morning air as I walked out of the new, heavily reinforced command trailer. The Appalachian Ridge Extension Project was alive again. The hum of the heavy machinery echoed through the valley, a steady, rhythmic heartbeat of progress. But this time, it sounded different. It didn't sound frantic, it sounded deliberate. The state had taken over the project entirely, establishing a public-private infrastructure trust to manage the completion. And they had hired me back as the chief director of engineering. No board of directors, no quarterly profit targets. Just the mountain, the steel, and the math. I walked down to the portal entrance. The jagged, terrifying ruin of the collapse had been cleared away. In its place stood a massive, interlocking skeleton of heavy steel I-beams, driven deep into the bedrock and bolted together with high-tensile steel plates. It was over-engineered, uncompromising, and completely impenetrable. Luke was standing near the portal, a steaming cup of coffee in his hand, watching a massive, heavy loader carefully move a section of pipe. He wore a state-issued safety vest now, looking 10 years younger than he had on the night of the collapse. "Morning, John," Luke said, his breath pluming in the cold air. He tapped a wrench against one of the massive steel beams framing the entrance. The sound was a dull, solid thud that resonated with absolute strength. "She's holding the load perfectly. The stress sensors haven't fluctuated more than a millimeter in 3 weeks. She'll hold for a century, Luke," I said, taking a sip from my own thermos. "Because we built her right. We gave the mountain the respect it demands." I looked deep into the tunnel, where the floodlights illuminated the perfectly spaced, redundant steel ribs marching into the darkness. There was no fear down there anymore. The men working the boring machine knew that the roof above their heads was locked in by science and uncompromising integrity. They knew they were going home at the end of their shift. "You hear the news out of Albany yesterday?" Luke asked, leaning against a steel strut. "I don't watch the news much anymore," I replied. "Wagner took a plea deal," Luke said, his voice quiet but thick with grim satisfaction. 15 years in a federal penitentiary. No possibility of early parole. Holloway is fighting the fraud charges, but they froze all his assets. The SEC gutted the company. I looked out at the frost-covered valley. I didn't feel a rush of joy or a sudden euphoric sense of victory. I just felt a quiet, profound sense of equilibrium. The universe had balanced its equation. "Gravity always wins eventually, Luke," I said quietly, turning my attention back to the blueprints in my hand. "It's time to get to work. We have a tunnel to finish." When you dedicate your life to a profession that deals in absolute physical laws like engineering, construction, or mining, you learn very quickly that reality does not negotiate. You cannot manipulate gravity with a clever PowerPoint presentation. You cannot gaslight a fault line into supporting a load it wasn't designed to bear. The tragedy of this situation wasn't just a failure of rock and steel, it was a failure of character. It happens every day in boardrooms across the world. Ambition is blindfolded by greed, and the people making the decisions are entirely insulated from the physical consequences of their arrogance. They view safety protocols as financial obstacles and experience as a roadblock to innovation. But when the dust settles and the catastrophic failure inevitably occurs, it is never the executives who pay the price in blood. It's the men and women on the ground. Standing firm on your boundaries isn't always about protecting your ego. Sometimes walking away from a toxic environment is the only way to avoid becoming collateral damage. You cannot force people to respect the truth, but you can refuse to participate in their delusions. A strong foundation, whether it's made of steel I-beams or personal integrity, is the only thing that will keep the roof from caving in when the pressure gets too high.